Hi everyone, I've got a little bit of a different vlog for you this time. I'm going to update you on some health news because I have just recently been diagnosed as having celiac disease. Came completely out of the blue. I'm in my late 40s and I've eaten bread products all my life. A very keen baker, as you may know if you've sort of watched some of my older cooking vlogs and things. So yeah, this was all a bit of a shock, and I thought I would do a little episode just talking through what happened with my health and how I got diagnosed, and then I'll do a little bit on baking at the end because I've already learned quite a lot about gluten-free baking, and I thought it'd be kind of fun to kind of document me learning this whole new area of baking, which is really very different. Celiac disease, if you don't know, is not a gluten intolerance. It's an autoimmune condition that can be really quite serious. It means when you eat gluten, the tissues of your intestines start to sort of attack themselves and they get really quite damaged, which means you stop absorbing nutrients and calories and things from your food, which can make you feel really quite ill. Obviously, a lot of people that have this condition first notice sort of stomach-related digestive symptoms. I had none of that, absolutely none of it. I just noticed that I was incredibly tired. I had a fatigue level that I'd never experienced before, and brain fog that was really bad as well. I've got quite a busy job, so the brain fog was kind of something that I was really noticing. And I was also sort of perimenopausal as well, and some of the symptoms are exactly the same for both, so there was a lot of confusion there. But I had to eventually realise that things weren't going great when I stopped being able to exercise at all. I mean, I'm quite active, I hike, I run, I do all sorts of exercise, and last year I was probably the fittest I've ever been. I was working out 5 days a week, I was climbing mountains last year, I was running 10k every Monday, 5k every Friday, and exercising Tuesday to Thursday. And there was a point where I just thought, I'm struggling to get through any of this. I was doing little bits and pieces, and I was just thinking there's got to be something quite wrong here because I just can't, I'm not able to physically do these things anymore. So I had a series of blood tests which came back very strongly indicating the possibility of celiac disease. There's a very particular antibody that appears in your blood which showed up. I then had to wait a little while to have an endoscopy, which was a really unpleasant experience. So what was the timeline? I wrote it down because I guess some people might be interested. I really was, around the end of last year, the beginning of this year, I was noticing the tiredness and the brain fog. I was also having a lot of joint pain and lower back pain. That can be part of this as well because it's sort of an inflammatory response in the body. So the blood tests were the 2nd of April, and then the endoscopy happened in May, and I got the results at the end of May. So that's 2 months. I think that's reasonably good for a sort of diagnosis of something like this, at least by the NHS standards in the UK. What was odd was that while you're waiting to have your endoscopy, they tell you have to keep eating gluten because it's important you don't muddy the results by sort of going gluten-free early. So that was an odd in-between phase where I actually felt I wasn't really taking on board the seriousness of this diagnosis because I was still enjoying my homemade bread and all the stuff that I usually eat. It felt a bit like a sort of last hurrah where I was just like, yeah, I can keep doing this for another month or two, it's fine. And then I did have a moment of sadness when I actually got the official diagnosis, and I thought, right, this is serious now, because people with celiac disease really have to be very careful on a minute level about cross-contamination and things like that. I mean, I'm supposed to have some consultations with doctors and specialists and nutritionists and things. That's coming up in the next few weeks, so I'll be able to ask in a bit more detail about all this stuff. Because when you don't have the obvious stomach symptoms with celiac disease, you don't know when you've had gluten accidentally. It's going to be a little harder for me to tell, you know, where I might be having issues. Some celiacs have a real reaction to something in oats called avenin, I think it's called. So I can't really tell if I have that sensitivity or not. If I was having an immediate reaction after, you know, a few hours after eating, I would be able to tell, but I don't have that. I just have a general, it just made me so weak and kind of foggy over time. So that has definitely started to improve, but I am wondering how I will monitor things when I don't have such an obvious kind of immediate response. Another thing they noticed from my blood tests was very low vitamin B12 levels, so they actually gave me a series of injections of those. I've only had the first one so far because they're every 3 months, I think, for a year. I can't say I really noticed any improvement after having the first one of those, but I will let you know if I notice anything going forward. I am definitely already noticing a huge improvement. When I was describing to friends what this fatigue and brain fog felt like, I said it was like a veil, having a veil in front of my face where I was looking at the world and felt really detached from it. And I couldn't tell if that was just exhaustion or what it was, but it was a very distinct fuzzy feeling where I didn't really feel present. And I noticed that probably about 2 weeks after going gluten-free, even though I eased into it a little bit, I wasn't super strict in the first week. 2 weeks later, I had a distinct moment where I felt that veil just lifted and disappeared, and I felt so much more normal. I'm still a little bit weak, and I'm only exercising I'm exercising 20 minutes a day at the moment, just easing back into it. But it's a massive relief to have that fogginess kind of lift. And I did read online that on average it takes 13 years for adults to be diagnosed with celiac disease, which I find absolutely incredible. I can't really imagine that I've had it that long. But I mean, I don't know how gradually it can kind of build, but it certainly feels quite quick to me that I only really noticed anything wrong at the end of last year, and we're now in June and it's already kind of been diagnosed and I'm already on my new sort of diet. So that does seem quite fast to me. So yeah, I have a huge amount of sympathy for anyone that's been struggling with their health for 13 years and has only just sort of started to figure out what the answer might be. And even though it was a big shock to me, considering I'm a huge home baker and I love pasta and bread, I was starting to wonder whether I might have something even worse. I was kind of wondering whether I might have MS or something, because I was just feeling so physically wrecked. So in terms of a comparison to that, I'm very grateful that it's not that, and that it's something with a very clear and easy sort of solution. It's not super easy. I mean, considering I don't eat out much, that's quite helpful. I think if you're used to eating out or takeaways, if other people are cooking for you, it can be very hard to sort of control exactly what it is that's coming into your diet. Luckily, I don't really eat out much. It is tricky if I go away, I'm on holiday or something, but I'm sure I'll make more videos in the future about my experiences on that side of things. So now I'm going to talk about my baking journey so far a little bit. It's only been a few weeks that I've been looking into this stuff, but I'll tell you about what products I've tried so far and what I've learned so far. So what I can't have is wheat, barley and rye, and there's a question mark over oats because some people have this cross sensitivity. I decided I would stop eating oats at the moment anyway until I felt significantly better, and then reintroduce it and see if I notice any difference at all. I thought that was probably the way to do it, so that's what I'm doing at the moment. So my first step at looking at my diet was to think about what I normally have for breakfast, lunch and dinner, and sort of start to make some lists of what's already gluten-free and what can be gluten-free with a little change here and there. Considering I decided to cut oats, breakfasts were a little tricky because Monday to Friday I was eating muesli with oat milk, so sort of double oats. So I've just switched to gluten-free cereal and almond milk at the moment. You can get oats and oat milk that are guaranteed gluten-free, but as I say, they tend to be quite expensive because they have to be processed in a very particular way, completely separately from other grains, and some people have a cross sensitivity. So for now I've got rid of that. So I'm just doing gluten-free cereal with fruits. My biggest breakfast treat has always been homemade sourdough. I make a loaf a week. I have that at the weekends, and that's going to be the biggest change for me because it's just something I absolutely love or have loved in the past. But I started to research and find that people were making gluten-free sourdough at home. So it's a whole new science. It's quite a bit more complicated. Growing the starter is kind of a similar process, but the mix of flours and other ingredients that you have to put together are a little bit more complicated. It's not like just 1 or 2 flours and water and a little bit of salt. It's a whole mix usually of sort of 5 or 6 different things. So I'll tell you a bit about my experience with that in a minute. What I did to start off with was I made a spreadsheet: breakfasts, lunches, dinners and snacks. And as I said before, I split it into stuff that's naturally gluten-free, I don't need to worry about, stuff that can be gluten-free with one switch, like pasta. You can have gluten-free pasta and you can do everything else the same. And then other things which might be a bit more involved to, I might have to skip altogether or have to do more research on. So I created this spreadsheet, and I was quite happy to find that in terms of dinners, there was a lot of stuff that was gluten-free already. Anything that's sort of potato or rice based was fine. I did eat pasta once a week, so that was something I was going to have to figure out. And I actually looked into sweet baking because I was worried about that. And I'm an obsessive recipe collector. I've got the Paprika app on my phone, and it's got over 400 recipes on it. They're all organised and categorised. And I looked at the sweet baking section and was actually quite heartened to realise how many of those recipes were gluten-free already, or were recipes where the flour element is quite small and switching to gluten-free wouldn't make that much difference. So stuff like, there's a lovely Basque cheesecake that I make, there's a Swedish chocolate cake, kladdkaka. I'm probably not pronouncing that right at all, but it has almost no flour. I also have these little almond cookies that I make with jam in the middle that are mostly almond, a tiny bit of white flour, so very easy to make that sort of thing and just substitute. If it's just a spoonful of flour, then the gluten-free flour won't make that much difference. I was a bit upset to kind of start looking into the Asian ingredients because I love cooking Asian food. Udon noodles are wheat, and those are my favourite noodles, so I can't have those. The types of noodles I can have are rice noodles, glass noodles, and soba, I think. I think buckwheat is okay for celiacs. So there are some noodles I can have, but when it comes to other typical Asian cooking ingredients like soy sauce and gochujang and oyster sauce, I've found that all of those often have gluten in them. So soy, it's quite easy to find gluten-free soy, but the other things I'm still working on at the moment, looking into how best to do those. I was very happy to realise that as a wine drinker, I would be okay. If I was a beer drinker, there are gluten-free beers, but they're obviously not the usual. So yeah, hopefully I should be fine continuing to drink my wine. And I was excited thinking, oh, crisps should be fine. If I ever have a treat, I'm a very savoury sort of person. If I ever have a treat, crisps are my ultimate treat. But I discovered that a lot of them have flour as part of the sort of flavouring coating on them. So there's some great lists you can find of the ones that are okay. So I'm just starting to learn which things I can kind of buy and which I have to leave behind now. The other thing I wanted to figure out was my partner and I have a weekend tradition where we have homemade pizzas on Saturday and homemade burgers on Sunday. And we make everything from scratch, the doughs, the sauces, the burgers themselves. The burger buns I tend to buy, and you can buy gluten-free burger buns, so I was kind of like, okay, that should be okay, but I often for these burgers, if we're not doing beef burgers, we sometimes do chicken and fish, and I breadcrumb them. So I realised I was going to have to find gluten-free breadcrumbs, which I did. Gluten-free panko, this has turned out to be really, really good, so that was an easy swap. That's what I mean about some things are sort of quite easy to make the substitution, where others are a bit more complicated. The main thing I wanted to figure out was pizza dough recipe, because a few years back my partner and I went through a whole series of experiments. Over the course of weeks and weeks, we refined our pizza dough recipe, doing lots of changes and seeing what worked and what didn't. And our favourite was this Caputo 00 flour, and we use mostly that. And I was really excited to find that the same company make a gluten-free flour that's specially for pizza and pasta. It's this one here, so I ordered a huge quantity of this. I was quite shocked at how expensive it was. And then I realised the reason it is that it contains all the odd little bits and pieces that you need to add to gluten-free flour to give it some kind of texture. So it contains psyllium husk and all these other little things that have to be added, so it's kind of ready to go. So even though it's expensive, it's a really good alternative to my old favourite. I also feel very lucky that I quickly found a gluten-free pasta that's really good. I had one experience of having gluten-free pasta once before. I think it was about a year ago or a year and a half ago, and it was hideous. It stayed hard while we were cooking it, and we cooked it and cooked it and cooked it, and then it very quickly just started to fall apart. Texture was absolutely horrible. So this one has turned out to be a fantastic substitute. Like everything else, it's more expensive, but for me, well worth it. I am going to try making homemade gluten-free pasta at some point, so I'll make a whole video about that, I'm sure, in the future, but for now this is perfectly good. Right, so now let's get on to bread, which is probably going to be the main focus of the rest of this episode. My lovely friend Rupa bought me this fantastic book, which, as you can see, I've been working through already. I really wanted to sort out the sourdough thing. I've tried a few different supermarket gluten-free breads. They're okay. Some are a lot better than others, but just for that weekend treat of a home-baked sourdough loaf, I really wanted something better. And I created this. This is my gluten-free starter, which I made following the instructions in this book. They have a couple of different starters. I just picked one to start with to try, and it involves 2 of these flours here, the brown rice flour and the white teff flour, and water. So it actually took a full week, I think, to start to get really active. And the instructions in this book created a lot of discard. I mean, I know from when I first learnt to make wheat bread that the traditional sourdough method that you're sort of told about does create a lot of discard, but I quite quickly refined my method to not do that, because it just seemed so wasteful, and I was baking once a week and storing it in the fridge in between, so it wasn't like I could just keep the starter active and being used every day or anything, like I was working in a bakery or something. So I had to find a way to reduce the amount of waste, and I did that quite successfully. That's what I'm now experimenting on with this, because when I first built this over the course of a week, this starter, I created so much discard that I was baking constantly. I had a little Tupperware in the fridge about this big, and I filled it 3 or 4 times over, completely full. Had to find recipes. She does have some great ones in here about things you can do with the discard. The main thing I was doing was baking crackers. I've got some footage of that I'll show you in a sec. I baked 3 rounds, 3 big batches of crackers and 1 big batch of chocolate cookies, which didn't go brilliantly, so I'm not going to show you those. But yeah, I've eventually got this starter, which seems quite active and happy, and I'm now working on the process of learning how to sort of keep it happy and fed and active without creating a massive amount of waste, because these flours are so expensive. The thought of just chucking half of it in the bin was quite upsetting, so I'm working out how to sort of feed it on a schedule that'll make it active enough to bake the next time. I've made 1 loaf so far, and I'll tell you all about that. The other thing I did was buy a new banneton, because I thought my old one was probably completely just covered in gluten in the sort of inside the material that would be hard to get rid of. So I've bought a new one just for these loaves. And while I was at it, I treated myself to something I should have bought ages ago, which are these silicone sort of slings for baking sourdough loaves. I always just cut a piece of greaseproof paper or whatever and baking parchment and use that. And that felt wasteful, because I would have to cut a new one every other time, and you know, it was a whole faff. So I'm really excited to have these. I ended up spending something like £150 in the first week just gathering the ingredients I would need for these first few recipes, and the bits and pieces like this, and pasta and cereal and all that stuff. So yeah, it can be expensive figuring gluten-free out, but hopefully it's worth it to have some nicer stuff to eat than the stuff you just find on the supermarket aisle. So yeah, I've so far made 1 loaf with this starter. It went quite well, better than I was expecting, although I definitely had some reservations about the finished loaf, and I know what I'm going to do differently with this second one. I'm just feeding it now to get it ready to try a second loaf. I'm going to film that whole process for you. I rushed through the first loaf in my excitement to get it done, so I didn't film very much of it. But yeah, it was quite gummy on the inside. It looked really, really good on the outside, but I think I cut into it too soon. The book said you can cut into it after an hour, which I was suspicious of at the time, but I did it anyway because I was so curious, and I wished I hadn't, because it was quite gummy and I should have left it overnight, which is what I always do with wheat loaves. But I'm still quite heartened. The taste of it is quite nice. This book warns you to just let go of trying to compare it to wheat bread. It's just never going to taste the same, and the texture's never going to be the same. But you just have to sort of develop an appreciation for the flavours of these new flours and just kind of get used to a whole new thing. With bread, it usually is the texture with gluten-free that's tricky. Gluten is the texture in bread. It's what creates that lovely chewiness, and you just don't have any of that. So the worst gluten-free breads, kind of, you take a bite and you feel like it dissolves into a paste in your mouth really quickly. It's not, crunchy and crispy and chewy. But the loaf I made had a fantastic kind of crust. It was a really crunchy crust, which was nice. And actually, because I eat it toasted, it didn't matter that it was a little bit gummy on the inside. But what I'm going to do now is feed this up, do a second loaf and film it for you. And I'll also show you now some of the process I went through with the sourdough discard, creating sort of gluten-free crackers and things. One thing I decided to do quite early on was a fun little project for myself to try and make this whole thing fun rather than sad. I had a cupboard in the kitchen that had a lot of flour products in it, and I decided to take everything out of that, clean it and sort through all the flours, see what I could keep and what I was probably going to get rid of, and then buy some new nice containers for my new flours and all these different products I've bought, and sort of label everything up nicely and put it in its own little cupboard. So I'll show you a picture of that. Already being quite an obsessive baker and collector of flour products, I actually had loads that I could still use that I already had. Potato starch, white rice flour, tapioca starch, corn flour, that's more tapioca starch, ground almonds, which I use in baking, masa harina, which corn flour I use for making tortillas, cornmeal for making American style cornbread, and coconut flour. So all of these I can continue to use. This is my little shelf that I'm going to give away to my friend. We've got self-raising flour, chapati flour, semolina, and just plain white flour. All of those I'm not going to hang on to. I'm still hanging on to my bread flours, my wheat bread flours, because I'm still making loaves in the bread machine for my partner. This is what feeding the starter looks like. It has a moussey texture rather than a stretchy one. I usually start by transferring it all to my discard container and then measuring some back into the glass to feed it. I still haven't mastered feeding it with hardly any discard like I used to with wheat bread, but I have massively reduced the amount of waste, I think. I read online that some people only feed the starter once before baking. So far mine doesn't seem to get anywhere near ready after just one feeding, so I feed it twice a day for a couple of days. I also do go by feel quite a bit when it comes to sourdoughs. My book's method for feeding the starter specifies quite high hydration feedings, and I found that twice I ended up with my starter getting really hungry and having a layer of water on the top, which means it was having too much water and not enough flour. So I switched the ratios up a bit for a stiffer mixture. With my wheat sourdough, I made it so often that I did end up mostly going by feel when it came to deciding on hydration levels. I just found the level of water that felt right to me, and I've been doing that with this starter too. Just adding a little more water or a little more flour depending on how the mixture feels, rather than following a very strict measurement. This morning I'm about to make my second ever gluten-free sourdough loaf, and this time I'm using a very slightly different recipe and method, so I'm interested to see what difference it'll make. I mean, they do say if you're experimenting with recipes to change one thing at a time so you can really tell what's made a difference, but like most people I get quite excited and decide to do multiple things at once, so we'll just see how it goes. My first attempt, I very closely followed the method in this fantastic book for the sort of white, it's called a white sourdough loaf. It's not particularly white in colour, but I'll tell you a bit about this recipe and then what's different with the one I'm doing now. Both recipes follow this method where you create a sort of pre-mix with your sourdough starter and some flour and water a little bit before you make your loaf. Sometimes in gluten-free baking they call it a sponge, which I think is a bit of an unpleasant term. So I've also seen it called a preferment, which seems to be a nicer term. And when I used to make wheat sourdough, I followed a similar method, made a levain, which basically means you take some of your sourdough starter, you make a pre-mix, and the entirety of that pre-mix ends up going into your loaf either later in the day or the next day. So with the first recipe, I'm going to read this because these recipes are so complicated. The sponge contained my starter, which is made up of 2 types of flour, brown rice flour and teff flour. Now, teff flour I'd never heard of. It's from a sort of Ethiopian grass seed, but it supposedly has really nice nutty flavour. So that's what's in my sourdough starter. And then the preferment contains some of that starter and also sorghum flour and brown rice flour and water. And then the loaf itself contained psyllium husk powder. You'll see recipes either call for whole husk or powder. I ended up buying both because I had multiple recipes calling for both things. Sorghum flour, tapioca starch, millet flour, and also all loaves tend to have water, salt, and either honey or maple syrup or sugar as a sweetener. I left the millet flour out because it was already, I think I mentioned earlier, I'd already spent £150 getting set up with my ingredients and things, and I just thought if I can leave one of these out, it was only a very small quantity, and I thought I'll just replace it with more of the brown rice flour. So I left the millet flour out. I'd also read some people saying they didn't really like it, so I thought for now I would leave that one. But let's see, 4 different flours plus the psyllium husk powder, and I thought that was plenty to be getting on with. Now the one I'm making today is a recipe I found online, which I have wanted to try since I first read about it, and it is very similar, slightly different sort of ratios of ingredients, but it also has potato starch as well as tapioca starch, and it uses the whole psyllium husk instead of powder, so I don't know what difference that'll make. They also add a little bit of olive oil, so I'm going to do that. And so the actual method and timings of what I'm doing, I'm varying as well today. When I made the first loaf, I made the preferment in the morning, and that needs to sit for sort of 3 to 4 hours usually. And then once you mix it into the loaf, that then needs to sit for, they said, either 2 to 4 hours at room temperature or 1 hour room temperature and 10 to 12 in the fridge. So with the timings of that day, my loaf was I made it at midday, and I thought, if I do the overnight fridge proofing, it'll be in there for sort of 18 hours. And that was so far above the sort of time range that she gives in the book that I decided not to risk it. I have read since that it should be totally fine to do that, but because it was my first try, I ended up making the preferment in the morning, the loaf sort of midday, and then baking it in the evening. This time the recipe I was following said that it would be fine to leave the preferment in the fridge overnight. And because I had a really lovely active starter yesterday evening, I thought I would make the preferment in the evening, stick it in the fridge, and then make the loaf this morning. So that's what I'm trying. I'm hoping that experimenting with these longer proofs will sort of give more of a sourdough flavour, which would be nice. So now I've got my preferment from last night, which I've taken out the fridge. It looks really great. It looks kind of full of air and lively. And I'm going to mix the rest of the loaf ingredients now. It'll then sit out for probably about 4 hours. The weather in London at the moment is crazy. When I made the first loaf, we were in a crazy heat wave, and now it's gone really, really cold. So it'll just be a case of watching it, then just keep an eye on it throughout the day and bake it at some point today. With these recipes, you always start with mixing the wet ingredients and the psyllium husk, because the psyllium husk absorbs loads of water and turns into a sort of gel, and it needs a bit of time. It needs 4 or 5 minutes to kind of fully do that, so I'm going to start with that now. A lot of these recipes also recommend using filtered water, which I am doing. I've got a water filter, and the water sits out in that for a few hours at a time, which apparently helps dechlorinate it. Apparently these kind of starters are quite sensitive, and it's quite important to use filtered water if you can. I never used it with my wheat loaves. I used to just use water straight from the tap, but yeah, with this I'm being extra careful because I'm just really keen for it to work well. Hopefully you can see how this feels a lot more complicated than baking wheat bread. I used to use 2 kinds of flour in a mixture, just strong white bread flour and a sort of some kind of brown malted or seeded flour for sort of flavour and texture, and water and a little bit of salt. That was all I put in my loaves, and now these are sort of 8, 9 different mixes of things, but it's quite fun to try. Here's my little preferment, which hopefully you can see is quite jiggly after being sort of left overnight. So the process is you mix the wet ingredients, the psyllium husk, it forms a gel. You mix your preferment into the gel and then you mix that into the flour and it'll become much more like a regular dough. It doesn't really feel like a dough. You knead it a bit, but it doesn't knead like a wheat dough. It's just not stretchy in the same way, but you just need to kind of mash it together until it's sort of thoroughly incorporated. And then I'll be putting it into my banneton. Here's my psyllium husk mixture, which has formed a sort of strange gel. And the purpose of that, I think, is to replicate the gluten because it's sort of quite stringy and it gives the dough that structure. In regular wheat bread dough, the structure is formed by the gluten strands being able to strongly hold together while the air bubbles appear in the dough, and then the gluten sort of holds it almost like a cage structure. And I think this is kind of what replaces that process in gluten-free baking. I will say one positive thing about all this is that the cleanup is a lot easier for gluten-free dough. With wheat flour doughs, you're essentially making a glue by mixing flour and water, and it's really hard to clean up. But with this, it's just run water on it and it's clean. I think I'm now ready to bake this. I've left it actually 6 or 7 hours today because it's been quite chilly. It's been under 20 degrees, but it's quite nicely domed. It never really, gluten-free loaves never really sort of double in size, but I think it's time to put it in the oven. These loaves tend to bake for a little bit longer than I'm used to. I think it's about 45 minutes for the first bake, and then I'll take the lid off the Dutch oven and give it another, I think it's another 40. I need to double check that. I'll report back in a minute. I'm just going to score this now and chuck it in with some ice cubes for a little bit of steam. It's time to get the loaf out and take the lid off and see how it's looking. I'm also now in the middle of cooking a biryani, so the kitchen is a little bit chaotic. Well, the loaf is nowhere near as risen as the last one. I don't know whether that's down to just how cold it's been today. I did leave it all day though, but my partner and I are kind of fond of bread that is quite dense. I'm not just saying that. He quite often asks me to intentionally make him a dense loaf. So I'm hoping it still might be okay. I won't actually cut into it until tomorrow this time. I'm going to give it another 40 minutes or so, test the interior temperature. I think you're aiming for about 95-ish degrees Celsius. And then I'm going to let it cool all night. It's Friday today. I've been thinking about yesterday's loaf and the fact that it really didn't rise very much, which is quite annoying, especially considering my first attempt rose a lot more. When I pondered it overnight, I did remember one thing. The first recipe suggested that the water that you put into your loaf mix should be quite a warm temperature, and I measured it quite precisely. So that would be something I would definitely try again. Maybe that kickstarts the rise. I mean, the weather doesn't help at the moment, but I did have it at one point sitting on my electric blanket to sort of warm it up. But obviously it didn't warm it up enough. Obviously my sourdough starter is still quite young, and I think it'll only get better as it sort of ages and gets used more and more. But I think next time as well, what I might try is not leaving the preferment for a slow proof overnight, but just doing that for 3-ish hours and then making the loaf and maybe leaving the loaf in the fridge to proof overnight. I'll be interested to see what difference that makes. I've cut a couple of slices here that I can show you to compare a shop-bought loaf, my first loaf and my second loaf. And also because it's Friday, in a second I'm going to go and make my 2 pizza doughs that I make every week. I can show you how easy it is to use the Caputo 00 flour for that. The results of that 00 gluten-free flour, I mean, it's still not quite the same. It doesn't have quite the same chewiness, and there's a kind of slight flavour that I pick up on that by the time I've eaten a whole pizza, I kind of start to notice it. But it's way better than I feared when I first learned I was going to have to go gluten-free. And also I keep thinking to myself, you know, I feel very lucky considering, you know, if this was happening to me, you know, 100 years ago or something, or even 50 years ago, yeah, the options would be, it would probably just be a case of not eating bread at all. So very grateful for that, and I'm grateful for the fact I didn't have a worse health problem. But still, it's this process of learning to bake gluten-free is a learning curve. So here's a sort of shop-bought white gluten-free loaf. It's quite alarmingly white, and it's also incredibly soft, so it's not the most exciting eating experience. This is a slice of the first sourdough that I made, which you can tell size-wise, it sort of blew up quite a bit bigger than this one. This was yesterday's loaf, and also it's more airy. It's quite a different colour, which is interesting. It had more of the brown rice flour and less potato starch. It had no potato starch, so that probably accounts for the colour. But yeah, this was just so dense. I mean, it tastes absolutely fine. The flavour of both of these are pretty much the same and are way better than that. It's just the sort of denseness of it. And this one, I baked it to within an absolute inch of its life. It got really quite dark. And I also left it overnight before I sliced it. So it's definitely not, it feels slightly gummy still, but it's way better than this one. But I just wish this one had risen a little bit more, but still it's interesting to experiment. Brilliantly, I was about to film myself making both of my pizza doughs that I make on a weekly basis, and I forgot to press record. So I've already got the non-gluten-free one underway in the bread machine, and I've put the ingredients into a bowl for the gluten-free one. I'll just show you that quickly. Yeah, in here we just have a little olive oil, the Caputo 00 gluten-free flour, a little bit of yeast, a little bit of sugar, water and salt, and now I'm going to mix it. This is regular pizza dough on the left and gluten-free on the right. So here's one of the recipes I've been experimenting with to use up my sourdough discard, of which I have quite a lot. This is the amount I have at the moment. And this is quite a strange recipe. I've done it twice already. I'm hoping this will be the charm the third time. You end up with an odd kind of batter more than a dough that you kind of have to spread out on the sheets and then bake it. So I think I've had 2 goes where I've learned a lot, and I'm gonna have a go now and see how they turn out. One of the things I was playing around with in the recipe was the amount of butter, because I thought it was kind of a lot. And I experimented with replacing it with just more olive oil. It's got a mix for the fat of butter and olive oil. And I tried last time a mix of olive oil and coconut oil. That gave it way too much of a coconutty flavour. So this time I'm going back to a little bit of melted butter and just a little bit more olive oil. So hopefully that might work. One thing I read with a recipe like this is that it can be risky reducing the fat, because the fat can help hold it all together. But the suggestion I read was to add some tapioca starch, which I have. I did that last time, it seemed to work really well, so I'm going to try that again. And at least I wrote down how many teaspoons of starch I added last time, which is handy. I'm doing a slightly smaller quantity this time, so maybe 2 teaspoons. Let's give it a go. So we've added the starter, the fat, which is olive oil and butter. Now we're going to add some psyllium husk, which I'm excited about because last time I used psyllium husk powder because it's all I had. The larger husks are recommended instead of powder, so I'm hoping that's going to work better. So let's see what happens. The problem with the powder is it can really clump into these little kind of really hard bits in the batter, which isn't very pleasant. It actually was okay to eat. I didn't really notice them once I'd eaten them, but I'm hoping I'll get a better result with this time. And now it's just sugar and salt, and the recipe calls for a little bit of paprika, which I'm very happy to add because paprika is delicious. And I treated myself to some everything bagel seasoning, which can be hard to find in the UK, but I found some in Marks and Spencer's, and it's just sort of sesame seeds and a bit of onion and garlic flavouring. I'm going to sprinkle that on the top. Hopefully that will make these extra tasty. So here we are all mixed together. It's a bit like hummus in looks and texture. It seems like a lot of gluten-free doughs and batters are like hummus, which is interesting. But yeah, this is looking good actually. It doesn't have the hard lumps of psyllium husk powder clumping together that I had before. So I'm going to spread this out on my lined baking trays now, sprinkle with the seasoning on the top, and then you do a sort of two-part bake, changing temperature halfway. And I found that if I sort of cut them into shape midway, at that midway point where I'm changing the temperature, they're still sort of slightly flexible enough to not shatter. The first time I attempted this, they were very, very tasty, the crackers, but they were so brittle they sort of fell apart. And then the second time I managed to make them hold together much better, but I don't think I baked them for quite long enough. They weren't quite dried out enough, so they ended up becoming quite hard when they sat for a little bit. And I'm hoping this is going to be the perfect midpoint. Well, that was quite hard to spread this time. It was thicker than usual, almost like plaster or something, and quite sticky, so it's hard to spread. You're supposed to spread it with an offset spatula, which I don't have, so that might be interesting to see how that works. But considering this is such a different texture to last time, I have no idea how these are going to turn out. You don't need to spread it super thin, because as it dries out in the oven, it tends to sort of shrink and get thinner. But I'm going to just add the seasoning on top and put them in the oven and see how it goes. So they bake now for 20 minutes at about 160, and then after 20 minutes reduce the temperature just a little to sort of 148-ish for another 10 to 15 minutes. You really want it to dry out so that they don't end up rubbery, they have a nice snap to them. I think you're supposed to let them cool on the tray, which I maybe didn't do before. I think I took them off too early. And I also read that if I feel like they haven't quite dried out properly, I can always leave them in the oven with the door open to just kind of dehydrate a little more. I've also got my air fryer has a dehydrate mode, so that's something I can try in the future if I feel like I haven't if I haven't baked them quite long enough, or I haven't left them to dry long enough. Right, I'm about to get them out and see if it's possible to cut them into cracker shapes. We'll see. One thing I should have said earlier is that one reason it's hard to tell whether you've baked them, sort of dehydrated them enough, is that they crisp up as they cool. So you kind of have to take them out and let them cool before you can really assess the finished texture. The first time I made them, they were so thin that it was very clear that they were going to be crispy enough, but they were a bit thicker the second time, and I think these are going to be a bit thicker too. So I'm prepared to just leave them in there as long as it takes, unless they look like they're sort of burning or anything. Okay, they're cuttable, so that's good. So far so good. They do seem a lot more like the second batch that I made, which I know need more time to for all the moisture to come out so that they can be crisp. So now it's just sort of a waiting game. I'm going to reduce the temperature a bit and then see how much extra time it takes now. I think these ones are dry enough, and these ones are a little flexible, so I'm going to give them a little bit longer. There's one more thing I'm going to do today, which I thought I'd share with you. There's a recipe for the sourdough discard that I've been wanting to try, which is crumpets. She calls them crumpets. They don't look particularly crumpet-like in the book. They look a bit more like English muffins, which would be absolutely fine because I love English muffins. But when you've got quite active starter discard, you just add a little bit of bicarb, I think. And I've made crumpets before, not for years and years, and you put them in a little metal ring in the pan and it all bubbles up. So I'm going to try that now, just to use up the little bit of discard that was left over from yesterday's loaf. Now I'm going to try these crumpets / English muffins. It's only 4 ingredients. It's your sourdough discard, which should be quite bubbly and lively. I think sugar, salt, and baking powder. So I'm going to see what weight of the sourdough I have here to decide, what size batch I'm going to do. And then I'll just mix everything together and see what the consistency is like. So the recipe is for 300 grams, I've got 450, so excuse me while I just do some maths to check how much of the other things I'm going to add. The recipe says the consistency should be a bit like heavy cream or pancake batter. Mine is probably too thick, so I'm going to add a little bit of water at a time and keep whisking until I think it's right. I think I'm going to stop there. I keep adding tiny amounts of water, but I want it to be just barely pouring consistency, which I think it is at the moment. So let's heat up the griddle and the crumpet rings and see how this goes. I think the idea is you're supposed to heat them, cook them through fairly slowly so that the inside has time to cook and it doesn't burn. So there can be a bit of adjustment with the temperature. I've started fairly low on the temperature on the griddle at the moment because I'd rather do that and then have to increase it than the other way around and burn the first few. I'm now going to try pouring in this batter halfway up the rings and see how it goes. We have a couple of bubbles starting to appear in the surface. It's supposed to take about 6 minutes before they'll be nearly ready to flip. Looks like a muffin. That's why I'm not going to be too upset if mine don't get huge bubbles in them. Well, I've been able to lift the rings off now. These didn't get many holes at all, as I was kind of suspecting, but I think they might be about ready to flip over. The two at the bottom worked better heat-wise, and they've got a lovely solid shape. These look kind of nice underneath. I'll be interested to see how they turn out. They look slightly rubbery, not going to lie, but probably perfectly tasty with some butter. So the muffins / crumpets were not nice to eat straight out of the pan, sadly. I was hoping they might be. They had quite a sourdough flavour, which is not my favourite. I mean, I love it in bread, but for things like English muffins, it's not really what I'm looking for. I don't massively love sourdough in sweet things necessarily. If it can be a little bit sort of overpowering, and just the texture wasn't great on those. They didn't rise very much. I think my baking powder is quite old, so I need to get some new baking powder, and also maybe the starter wasn't active enough. So they weren't nice straight out of the pan, but I ended up cutting them in half sort of crossways so that they're made two very thin little discs. And I stuck those in the freezer, and I've had them all of this week with my lunches, just with some sort of hummus and sauerkraut and salad and stuff on the top, and they're actually really nice like that. It made me think that one thing I would like to experiment with is making some kind of sandwich loaf or something like that, some kind of bread that's actually nice to eat untoasted. That's not something I've experimented with yet at all. So something I might try next is a sort of yeasted sandwich loaf. I've read that you can use egg as a sort of binding agent in gluten-free sort of sandwich loaf type bread. So far, I think for sourdough discard, I think the crackers are by far and away the best use for that. I did make some chocolate cookies, which the flavour was absolutely wonderful on those. It's just that I think I left them baking for a bit too long. So I am going to make those again, and I'll be sure to film it if I do. But so far, yeah, the crackers are the winner for me as far as using up the sourdough discard. In terms of the bread flour, a lot of the recipes I come across are American, and they were all saying make sure you use super fine brown rice flour, which I've not been able to find. I can only find stone ground, so I don't know what kind of difference that makes. I've also got some white rice flour, which I mostly use for dusting my banneton to stop my loaf sticking. But I could try using some of that in a loaf as well as the brown rice flour. That might be interesting. And I just want to experiment in general with different flour mixes. I have a bunch of flours sitting in my Whole Foods online sort of shopping basket that I haven't pulled the trigger on yet, but at some point when I feel I can spend some money again, I'm going to do that. And it would also be fun to do some loaves with seeds in as well, since texture is often the issue with sourdough loaves. There's a supermarket brown seeded loaf that I get that's quite nice, so I think making some loaves with seeds in is something I want to try as well. So yeah, thank you very much for watching this first episode of my celiac disease sort of vlogging diary. If you have any tips for me, if you have celiac yourself and you've sort of experimented with baking at all, please do leave me a comment or link to a recipe that you think works really well. For the next vlog, I'm thinking of baking some sweet and savoury things that I know will work well, because that would be a nice change. Because as I said at the start of this episode, I've got recipes where I know the flour isn't going to make a huge amount of difference, or I've tried it before, or it's just naturally gluten-free. I'd like to make American-style cornbread soon. Corn tortillas, I've been making corn tortillas for years, so I think I've got those sort of down. And I definitely want to do a bit of sweet baking as well next time. Oh, and there's one more thing I wanted to pass along. If you're in the UK and you're looking for a good gluten-free burger bun, I tried a few that I really didn't like, but I finally tried these Marks and Spencer's Tiger Rolls, which actually completely transformed my burger experience last weekend. So that's my recommendation to end the episode on. And yeah, thanks again for watching.